History's Historic Venues webinar series. Fabulous. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me tonight. This will be the first webinar of the Historic Venue series. My name is Jessica Knapp, and I have been emailing you for the past while, and I'm the online engagement coordinator at Canada's History Society. If it hasn't been clear already, I will be your host for tonight's webinar, which Matt will be speaking about using historic sites in the classroom. His presentation, Engaging with Upper Fort Garry, will focus on a fur trader's focal point in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So a little bit about Canada's History Society before we get into everything today. Canada's History Society is a national charitable organization dedicated to making Canadian history popular for a general audience. We do this in a number of ways, including our flagship publications, Canada's History Magazine, formerly known as The Beaver, and Kayak, Canada's History Magazine for Kids. Matt has a history with Canada's history, specifically with our awards program. In 2013, Matt was awarded the Governor General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching. This award was created in 1996 to recognize exceptional history educators and to encourage greater collaboration and exchange of ideas within Canada's teaching community. Since 1996, Canada's history has celebrated hundreds of recipients and finalists while creating a national network of enthusiastic and innovative history teachers. Most recently, Matt received the Government of Canada's History Award for Teachers for a collaborative project. The Government of Canada History Award is presented to both students and teachers. The Student Essay Contest asks grade 10 and 11 students to tackle one of 5 challenging questions about Canadian history. Questions ask students to assess topics such as the legacy of Sir John A. Macdonald and Louis Riel, the impact of the war years on lives of women, Canada's relationship to the Arctic and its people, how historians assess different primary sources, and what the Canadian flag means to Canadians 50 years after official unveiling. The Teaching Award asks teachers to submit high school level lesson plans and projects based on one of the 3 themes, including symbols of Canada, war, World War II, and Canadian Prime Ministers. If you want more about these awards, you can click on the link at the bottom of the slide, and that will bring you to the page on our website. The deadline for these 2 awards is April 17th, 2015, and I encourage you to share this information with students that you may teach and teachers that you may know, because everybody should have an opportunity to be recognized for the excellent work they're doing. So finally, the last few things before I hand the conversation over to Matt. To prevent any glitches or lags over the next hour, close any applications that are open on your computer that you don't actually need. This will enhance your experience tonight and leaving you with a positive experience. But if there is issues, don't fret. You will be able to watch a recording of this webinar later this week on our YouTube channel. That link is there on that slide if you want to bookmark that for later use. Also, if you're on social media, please spread the word about the conversation tonight. If you don't have them at easy access, I have included our Twitter handle and our Facebook link there. And you can tell all your friends, you can tweet or Facebook about what you're learning and what Matt's saying. That would be excellent. I will also be sending a survey to all those who have registered after tonight's webinar, or more likely when the recording goes up, and I would really appreciate your feedback, whether you are watching it live tonight or at a recording in the future. So without further delay, I know Matt gave a brief introduction, but for those of you who have recently joined us, Matt Henderson teaches senior school social studies at St. John's Ravencourt School in Winnipeg. He has a passion for creating educational experiences for students and using their experiences as a means for transformation. With the understanding that education is meant to create agents for social change, Matt is fascinated by the relationship between experience, ecological literacy, and systems thinking. In addition to the Governor General's Award in History for Excellence in Teaching and the Government of Canada History Award, Matt is the recipient of the Archives Association Manitoba Award. He is a graduate student at the University of Manitoba, a sessional instructor at the University of Winnipeg, and a regular contributor to the Winnipeg Free Press and CBC. Without further ado, Matt, I do hand tonight over to you. And I will
Very
bring
cool.
up
Yeah.
your
And if at any point folks can't hear me, just type through it kind of thing and let me know. And if you hear strange noises in the background, my kids are sort of getting pretty rangy, and there's a boil water advisory in Winnipeg right now, so bath time has been obliterated. So we're trying to deal with that. But I'm sure many of you are in the same boat or have been there at some point. Oh, don't put the www, sorry, in the preview upperfortgarry.com. Just put HTTP. Sorry, that was my bad. Yeah, I'm going to have you guys, if you want to have the Google Earth of Winnipeg for a street view, that might help you. I'm going to try and maybe see it. Maybe Jess will be able to pull it up at the end. And then the website, preview.upperfortgarry.com. I'll explain that in a little bit. But as Jess was saying, I do teach at St. John's Ravenscourt School, which was the St. John's part was essentially brought in by the Hudson Bay Company. So there is a connection in that way to Upper Fort Garry. And I'm heavily interested in not only the venue of Upper Fort Garry, but its history, its story, and its relationship that it has with Red River and Winnipeg, because it symbolizes, I think, in history times when people have shared space really, really well in this area of the world, and times when people have not shared space very well at all. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, and how we can really provide experiences for kids to sort of go, oh, wait a second, yeah, that's incredible, and cause that cognitive dissonance or that disequilibrium, where there can be growth, where they can say, yeah, I've been transformed. I am a different person from understanding this particular venue. What's great is that if you go to the Upper Fort Garry website, the preview, upperfortgarry.com, don't put the triple W in, I apologize. It's still under construction. The Upper Fort Garry Provincial Park is still building that because it's just partially open now. But for those folks, I saw that some people were in Ontario, other people were in Colorado, in different places. You'll be able to access it when it's fully functioning, and really be able to take your learners through an interesting experience with Google Earth, and using their imaginations, which is probably the most powerful tool. Yeah, the website's cool, and it's I would say it's about 30% complete. And so anyway, let's begin. And when I say experiences, just as a preface, what I mean, um, I just came back, actually, interestingly enough, from the Independent Schools Experiential Education Network. I don't just mean experience like we're taking kids out of the classroom, or we're taking kids on trips, or they're at a soup kitchen or something like that. I mean experience in the sense that everything's an experience, right? When kids are writing a multiple choice test, that's an experience. They may not be learning the outcomes that we've designed, but they're learning something. And so what I'm talking about in terms of experience is sort of in a Deweyan or Freirean respect, where there's the experience. We're using the experience of the learner to create disequilibrium, to create educative experiences, so that they keep, we generate that inquiry and curiosity. And then eventually, uh, the students are transformed to become these agents of social change, and better people ultimately. So, having said that, here you see the first slide is a picture of Fort Garry itself, Upper Fort Garry, um, across from St. Boniface. And if you know your geography, Fort Garry is at the crossroads, basically, of the Assiniboine River and the Red River at the Forks. If for those people who have never been to Winnipeg, where the Assiniboine River runs east-west and bumps into the Red River, and right smack there would have been where Upper Fort Garry is. There is one remaining wall that is situated just north of the Assiniboine River, and that is City of Winnipeg property. And in the last few years, construction has been underway by the Friends of Upper Fort Garry to create a provincial park, and it officially opened in October, part of it, and now it's a park with some, and it's going to be a provincial park within a city that is not a traditional museum per se. It'll have a digital element to it, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But you can certainly find that at if you just go straight to upperfortgarry.com. Um, okay, so I think I can advance the slides with these little arrows. Okay, so if you're familiar with Chester Brown's um, biography, his graphic novel on Louis Riel, he's got two really cool maps that I love. I don't know about you, but I love maps. And I love putting, and that students often really love maps, but I can look at them all day long. And this is one of the cool maps at the beginning of his book. And if you haven't read the book, please do. It's outstanding. But this is basically Red River in 1869. You see where the Assiniboine runs into Red River. And if you're from Winnipeg, you know these neighborhoods. Certainly St. Vital, St. Charles, St. Boniface, St. Norbert, Fort Garry is there, St. James, Headingley, and the Kildonans. These are all former parishes within the Red River settlement. And this map, to me, in 1869, represents a real diversity uh, in in Red River that has existed essentially since 1738 when La Vérendrye first came out, but even before then, even 6,000 years ago, when so many different First Peoples were out and trading in this area and coexisting and not coexisting so well. And so it's a real meeting place, and it's a real place where you have to share space. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'd be interested to read what you guys have to say about the Maclean's article. Winnipeg blew up over it, and I'm not really sure why. It wasn't a big secret as to why that happened. But I often show this to students so that they have a contextualization that Winnipeg does have a history, and this is only 100 years ago, 150 years ago. This particular map, and so then we go on to the next map that Chester Brown draws, and really shows the impact of the Hudson Bay Company. And for what I do with my students is that for many months, we basically do an investigation, some project-based learning inquiry into the Hudson Bay Company. Because if a friend of mine, Kevin Nickel, who's the curator of the film Romance of the Far Fur Country, I don't know if folks have seen that, but it's a film originally filmed by the Hudson Bay Company in 1919, and it's absolutely stunning. If you have a chance, look it up, Romance of the Far Fur Country. But he brought the film in. I don't know if anybody wants to put the link up there when you find it. But he came in and curated with my students this film, and he said something really interesting. He says if you don't understand the Hudson Bay Company, the history of it, you cannot possibly understand the history of North America, of Canada in terms of European interaction. And you certainly can't understand the history of Red River. You can't understand Upper Fort Garry and Winnipeg. You can't understand that Maclean's article without understanding the Hudson Bay Company, arguably. And it's basically chapter two, I think, in any Canadian history course, if you want to contextualize it that way. That if you don't understand this crazy corporation in 1670 that was given all of Rupert's land, you see all the lined area, all that area draining into the Hudson Bay Company. That was quote unquote given to the Hudson Bay Company by the King of England, and uh, uh, and not really understanding that you can't really give someone else's land away. And this brings in so many different uh, problems of property ownership that the kids really try to grapple with, all the way to the Red River Resistance, right? Who owns land, and into the treaties after Manitoba enters Confederation, who really owns um, land, or even with the Royal Proclamation in 1763, right? Can the king actually say, "Hey, wait a second, I'm the only one who can negotiate with First Nations. Um, so this is another great map where the kids really say, "Wow, that's incredible! Yeah, how could the King of England possibly give that territory to the Hudson Bay Company?" And then we go through a whole bunch of explorations. Oh, thanks, Jess. Um, where the kids investigate thoroughly the HBC, and luckily in Winnipeg, we have the Hudson Bay Company archives at the Archives of Manitoba, so we truck down there a couple times a year to pick that apart, and the archivists there are really great. So if you're a history teacher in Winnipeg, take advantage of the Hudson Bay Company archives. They're outstanding. Contact Denise Jones there, and she'll set you up. Uh, and so what I try to do is I try to use the experience of the students so they understand Winnipeg. They live in it, and they have their own story within it. Here you see there's the forks. You see the Assiniboine River snaking at the bottom left into the Red River. And even today we had with the students, we were sort of unpacking the Winnipeg General Strike, and they were able to sort of say we were looking at class, gender, ethnicity divides in 1919 versus 2015, and they were able to really offer some really outstanding insight because they live here and it's part of their experience, and their parents lived here and their grandparents lived here. um, even our boarding students, we have boarding students here who have a limited experience in Winnipeg, are able to offer insight into those divides within contemporary Winnipeg, and that's important, right? It's important to cherish the experience, the knowledge that students have. I think that's critical for any learning community, and also the students. This is you see our school there in that little Oxbow Lake, that big patch of white right beside the river. That's our school, and then that green cluster of trees across the field there is Wildwood, and I actually live in there. And so we are actually wrapped around this thing called the Red River. So the students see the river every day. That has historically been the source of life in this area for many years. Now, I'm sure a lot of you know a tremendous amount of the history of Red River, but for those of you who don't, I'm just going to go through it really quickly. I don't want to bore you at all, and I'll probably make lots of mistakes, but it's probably a good idea to, if you don't know sort of the history of Red River, and when I say Red River, I mean Winnipeg, okay, that you have a little bit of an idea of um, sort of the chronology at least. But in terms of sharing space, I'll start with when La Vérendrye shows up in 1738. Of course, the French government sort of in New France was sort of hit and miss when they wanted people to come out this way and do some exploration, partly because there were some differences in opinion as to whether or not they should establish a community along the St. Lawrence, but then all the beaver had been hunted out and whatnot, and all the Huron were dying, and so they needed different trading routes and trading partners. But La Vérendrye came out in 1738, the first white man out in this area, and that basically brought in the first Europeans to the community, and was eventually sort of the birth of the Métis or the Métis in this particular area of the world. And the Hudson Bay uh, um, wasn't really in the picture at that point in 1738. But what that opened the door to later in this century, nearing the end of the 18th century, was the Northwest Company, clever bunch of guys in Montreal, to sort of say, hey, we can undercut the Hudson Bay Company. Because keep in mind, the Hudson Bay Company, basically what they did is they built factories or forts along the Hudson Bay and James Bay and waited for indigenous people to bring them the furs. And the Northwest Company sort of said, well, hey, actually, we have a better business model. We're actually going to meet indigenous people in their own territory and trade with them. And so that's what you see at the end of the 18th century, and that the Northwest Company eventually starts to take a massive chunk and even outmaneuvers the Hudson Bay Company. And in Red River, this is, and you see that map there. I'll explain this in a second. Most of you probably know what that is. But in Red River, that caused a bit of a problem because keep in mind, um, a lot of people, or people, the Hudson Bay thinks that this area belongs to them at the beginning of the 1800s. But now you have the Northwest Company setting up forts. You have this strange new population of sort of half-breed Métis people, and you have indigenous people as well, Cree, Ojibwe, and they're all trying to sort of share space. But the Hudson, it's kind of difficult when you have these two capitalists trying to compete for allies and compete for resources. And obviously, this is going to create a problem. Now, by 1811, 1812, this Selkirk in Scotland, sort of a rather rich dude, and I think his heart was in the right place, is sort of upset that there are impoverished Scottish people getting booted off their land, and sort of works out with the Hudson Bay Company after buying some shares to sort of transplant some poor Scots into the area of Red River so that they can start a community here. I won't go too much into that, but you can imagine sort of how insane that could have been, traveling all the way to York Factory and stumbling down to Lake Winnipeg and arriving in September with nothing, and luckily Pegwis was around to sort of help everyone out. But basically, what you had is the Hudson Bay Company saying, "Okay, Northwest Company, if you want to play hardball in Red River, and you want to compete with us, well, we're going to put a bunch of agrarian English-speaking people smack right in the middle, who are going to carve up the land and put up fences and kind of mess with you as well." And obviously, this didn't really sit well with the Northwest Company and the Métis, and cause more friction. And then the Hudson Bay Company retaliates with the Pemmican Proclamation, basically saying that you can't export any food out of Red River. This upsets the Métis, who are making money selling pemmican to the Northwest Company, and on the troubles. People aren't sharing space, and it leads to 1816, 17, basically a full-out war between the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company, where they're sacking each other's forts and doing some pretty rotten things to each other. And that's pretty bad for business. At which point the Brits come in, well, sorry, about 1817, Pegwis comes and sort of says, "Hey, everybody, come on, we can chill out, we can share space, relax." And so Pegwis signs a treaty with Selkirk, and this is what you see up on the slide here, where he says, "Okay, hold on, everybody, just relax. We can all share space." And they sign an agreement in order to share space around Red River. Selkirk only adheres to it for a year, his part of the bargain. Then he dies a few years later. So it wasn't really that successful, but it was one, because also you have to keep in mind Pegwis and Selkirk have different ideas of what it meant, a treaty meant, right? Uh, and I think that's relevant today in 2015. Um, so anyway, by 1821, the Hudson Bay Company, or the Brits, are saying, "Hey, what's going on in Red River?" And they forced the two companies to sort of amalgamate under the Hudson Bay Company. The Northwest Company shareholders do pretty well for themselves, so don't shed too many tears. And so now you have a period between about 1821 to 1869 where there's relative peace and stability in Red River. People are kind of getting along. It's really, really diverse population. You have Swiss mercenaries that were brought in by Douglas, sorry, Lord Selkirk, and you have Métis. Now you have Scots, and you have Scottish half breeds, and you have Brits and all that kind of stuff, and uh, First Nations. And it's a bustling little place. And then the Hudson Bay Company create the Council of Assiniboia, which is sort of the de facto government in the area, which is and they're able to kind of create some peace. Now, of course, create um, when you create a government, you need sort of a headquarters. And when you're a fur trader, and if you see this slide, this is sort of a funny little slide, but if you travel up to the top left, and I'm sorry I don't have a little pointer, but if you travel to the top left, you can see where the Assiniboine comes into the Red River, and you can see a little tiny fort there. The what used to be there was Northwest Company Fort, Fort Gibraltar. That was sacked during the Fur Trade War, which was kind of nutty. And then in 1822, the Hudson Bay Company says, "Okay, well, if we're amalgamated, we need a fort." So they build a fort there. They call, oh, look at that! Holy doodle! Can I operate that? Oh, whoa! All right. Okay, that's amazing. Thanks, Jess. Um, so there's Fort Garry there. And so they say we need a headquarters. They call it Fort Garry after Nicholas Garry, who's the deputy governor of the HBC, and things are pretty cool. Now, some of you are probably looking at this going, "Oh, that looks precarious because I hear it floods a lot in Winnipeg." Well, you're right, and students like that too. They're, "Hey, wait a second, that doesn't it flood around there?" In 1826, there was a really, really bad flood, and it basically destroyed the entire fort. Um, and as you can, this is obviously pre-floodway and all that kind of stuff. So Winnipeg went through terrible floods all the time. In 1826, the Fort Garry was done. A little bit later, so in 1831, they sort of said, okay, the Hudson Bay Company, let's build another fort, but let's put it on high ground. And so they built Lower Fort Garry, just where St. Andrews and Lockport are right now. But the big problem with that is, of course, location. And Lower Fort Garry, even if you go out there today, the kids figure out right away like this was not a significant place. This was basically some sort of strange FedEx depot, and so they built another Fort Garry in the same spot downtown in 1835, and that was basically the home for about 30 years of the fur trade and the Council of Assiniboia and basically the Northwest. Um, Everything was relatively peaceful until about 1869. Of course, when Hudson Bay Company surrenders Rupert's Land to Canada and kind of says, "Okay, hey, we'll give you guys this land, but in return we'll get some goodies as well." And that's for another conversation. But we know that Fort Garry was the when Canada started bringing surveyors out. Riel and his crew, their first action, of course, when you are resisting, is to take military control. And so they took military control of the only fort around, and that, of course, was Hudson Bay Company Fort Garry. So they went in pretty peacefully, and they took that with overwhelming ease. And then they set up the first provisional government. There were sort of three types of governments within that 1869-70, but the first provisional government was basically just a military one. And then that would turn into the Convention of 40, and then finally the Legislative Assembly of Assiniboia that would actually approve the Manitoba Act later in 1870. But I don't necessarily want to go too much into the resistance at this point. But so what you have is finally after, I mean, basically you have Fort Garry, Upper Fort Garry. Thomas Scott is assassinated in it, and that's where the Manitoba Act is agreed upon, and basically Manitoba becomes part of Confederation within the context of that fort, which is, and we ask the students to think historically when they're looking at significance. That's a big one. By 1873, however, and I'll just move to my next slide. Sorry, there's a picture of sort of the diversity that would have been Fort Garry in 1860. You have a Métis person in the front, probably Cree person on the left there, and then various people sort of just hanging out. At 1873, Winnipeg's incorporated or established, and that's when the Talker Railroad is coming in, and things basically everything is started moving north from Fort Garry um, to the Exchange District. And by 1881 to 1884, Fort Garry is basically demolished unceremoniously. It's sort of just picked apart. It's mostly to make Main Street straight, and only the front gate is actually left. And eventually, the Hudson Bay Company give that to the city of Winnipeg, and that's what remains today. Okay. Are there any questions at this point? Any confusion as to sort of the chronology? Seems like people are okay, or I've put you to sleep. Don't worry, my students sympathize with you. Um, okay, cool. Um, And so how I do this, I'm not sure if you can see the oh, Jay's typing something here. Just pause for a sec before I get into sort of the teaching and learning part. Oh, okay. Right on. And so I don't know if folks are well aware of the six historical thinking concepts, but that's how I um, teach history. And what I say to the students is we teach the doing of history. I don't. The content is one thing. The content sort of helps us learn how to think historically and think um, critically about who we are and go through sort of that Socratic self-examination and be able to sort of connect with the other and bring down those barriers of the other. So one of the things that we did this year as sort of a learning tool. And you can check out my site and see some of it at mrhenderson.ca if you go into some of the archives from October. Is that I took my students on a field trip, and the first thing that we did is that we went to four different places in Red River, and I did a lot of front loading. We did a lot of work beforehand, and we were looking at um, two historical thinking concepts. One was historical significance. How do you determine historical significance of a person, movement, place, whatever? And then how do you, and then also the notion of continuity and change. What has stayed the same and what has changed in Red River? And so we started off at the Forks, and we started looking at uh, the history of Red River from about 6,000 to 12,000 years before. And we looked at some of the artifacts there from an anthropological perspective. And then we went across the street. We went over to Fort Garry, where we were able to explore and look at the wall, look at where Thomas Scott was assassinated, looked at where the Donald Smith on January 19th would have sort of tried to convince the residents to accept Canada's deal unsuccessfully. And so the kids were able to really sort of experience that and go, okay, I kind of understand. I understand the geography. I understand that this actually happened here, and it becomes real, and that there's some merit to that. Then we crossed the river, went into St. Boniface, went to the St. Boniface Museum, which is the oldest building in Winnipeg in terms of that's where the Grey Nuns were situated, and now it's basically a museum on the Métis. Louis Riel went to school, so they were able to see sort of the way of life on the other side of the river. There's a divide. And then we came to Union Station, the train station, which really symbolizes that transition from fur trade, agrarian lifestyle to the industrial age, sort of pre First World War, just after. Because what you have to understand is that Winnipeg in 1911 was one of the fastest growing cities on planet Earth. Okay, it was booming. It was huge, and people were coming through not only Union Station but the CPR line just north, and then sort of the Panama Canal and the First World War kind of killed that. But anyway, so they were able to look at these and really think about um, how Winnipeg has stayed the same, how it has changed, and then also the significance of some of these places that they pass by every day. And then we were able to have a larger conversation, particularly in the last few weeks. And there's been some editorials in the last few months with the election of our new mayor about how people share space now in Winnipeg and how they did it not only in 1869, but before that, and then 1816, 17, where there was friction and what are possible solutions for today? And that's what I really think is the point of learning about Canadian history, and not sort of in a cliche like how do we learn from the past, but to be able to say who are we as people, are we the same, are we different, and then how do we overcome these differences and how do we break down these barriers between the others? And so part of the fun about teaching is actually getting out of the classroom, using technology. The kids use WordPress sites to document their travels. They use Evernote to take pictures and um, to make audio recordings of even trains coming by, so that they can really get the texture and all the tastes of the city. And so that's what we've been talking a lot about this week. We're doing 100-minute classes this week. Normally we do 55, and we looked at sort of the transition of Winnipeg and Red River since basically 1738 all the way to the general strike. And in light of the Maclean's article that came out saying that Winnipeg's the most racist city, and the kids have been sort of profound solutions and profound observations because they have an experience here and they understand the history, and they're inheriting this city that is, um, it's a beautiful city, but it's also broken in many, many ways. So I think what I'll do is I'll stop there. Um, you can look at the preview fortgarry.com website. And I'm just speaking on behalf of the Upper Fort Garry folk. It's just a model. Play around with it. I love to use Google Street View. So you can look at the current wall at Fort Garry. You can look at Union Station. You can look at the forks. The students can create their own maps. Another thing that we use is history pins, which is a great way of making maps and putting markers. And you can get that for not only the desktop, but all your little gadgety stuff. But I'm going to stop. If there are questions, tap away. I've talked for far too long. Tap away, and maybe there's something that I'm missing. Some of this stuff seems obvious to me, um, but but let me know. But this is certainly something you can do with your students, whether you're in Winnipeg or you're not in Winnipeg, because I think if you're going to understand the history of Canada, you need to understand the history of Hudson Bay Company, and you can't ignore the history of Red River. That's awesome, Claire, that this is making nostalgia. You can come back anytime. You can show your American students this too, though. Okay. Oh, very cool. Thanks, Gary. That would be a really great resource. I'll bug you soon.
Matt, that is an incredible website.
Yeah, and the Fort
Do you,
Garry one, I have nothing to do with that. So, let's see what
oh,
I didn't make that at all. That's the Fort Garry folks. I just use it. I steal it and I use it. So if Joanna says, I'll be interested to hear more about the ideas and experiences of some of your international students. Yeah, and just give me a second, Christine, and I'll just deal with Joanna's question. It's funny, we have about 40 boarders at SJR, and they come from all over the place, mostly Asia, but certainly some from South America as well. And one of our students, Jason, and I'll show you him right now. Here's two of my boarders. There we go. They came to the official opening of Fort Garry. There's Jason on the left and Alicia from Germany on the right, and they came to sort of volunteer and open it up. And on a freezing day, but Jason was talking yesterday about, or this morning, about the divides and racism in Winnipeg, and he said something very simple like, I love Winnipeg. He plays the flute with the symphony, and he says, but when I go to Costco, people treat me differently, and I see people treat African people differently, and those articles are now, and those stories are starting to come out, eh? And whereas Alicia today, she remarked as we were talking about it, she said, "Look, I come from Germany, and I think people are so open and welcoming here." And she says it's a shock that when I hear about the racism that exists, particularly uh, that's um, that's demonstrated towards First Nations people, that she was sort of shocked. So there's two different interpretations, but they're very, very aware of um, the tensions, and but they're open to it because they're vulnerable. They come over here. They don't know anybody. There's a ghettoization they were talking about. Miguel from Mexico was talking about today, even amongst the borders, right? You ghettoize. These people sit at this table for lunch. These people sit at this table. And one student today, one Chinese student said today, it's very interesting that, she noticed right away that Filipino people live in one part of the city, people from India live in one part of the city, indigenous people live in one part of the city, White people live in one part of the city. Chinese people live near the university. She was saying it's very, very interesting how Winnipeg has divided itself, and so these are people from outside our community who have made these distinctions. And then Christine, how are students talking about the future? Does it link to your conversation about what Winnipeg used to be? I think when we talk about it, I mean, for them, um, it's a big awakening grade 11 for them. And I don't want to speak for all of them because they're all at different stages of development, right? And I don't want to generalize. But part of the transformation I think that happens in this course is that they understand who the most vulnerable people are in our society, that everybody in this community are our brothers and sisters. And one of the first places we start um, is on stereotyping. I mean, we have to develop a relationship as a learning community first, and you have to have a tremendous amount of trust before you start talking about these things. But my co-teacher Heather today said something really interesting. She said, "How do you guys feel when you go out wearing your uniform? Right? What do people think about you just based on your uniform?" And that's a great place to start, where we start a lot of the times to sort of say people have preconceived notions of who you are, just like you have of them. And so that's a great place uh, to start these students on a journey of self-examination and understand what their role is in the city. I don't think they're necessarily, Christine, to answer your question, at a point to offer massive solutions. I think most of them have open hearts, and I think I mean, what we do, particularly, and a lot of these students have never met someone who's First Nations, right? A lot, and so what we do is we build connections with elders. They come in and speak to our students, whether they're writers or professors or just friends of mine who come in to talk about different programs. And they say, hey, wait a second, this is not my understanding of who First Nations people are. And it's not tokenism, it's just and Illich talks about this in chapter 6 of Deschooling Society, where it's important for young people to have a Rolodex of elders. And so that's what we're trying to generate, this capacity for them to rely on, not just elders in the First Nation community, but elders across the community. So I'm hoping that when they develop the cognitive capacity and that executive functioning, they understand that they're connected not only to every person but every system, and that they make those decisions that are responsible. Angus, when you visit the sites with your students, assume you use historic first-person accounts. I found that in my experience, doing so makes the site does it come alive? Yeah, and that's one of the things that they're trying to build into the site. I mean, obviously, one of the 6 historical thinking concepts is using primary sources, and they're building that into the site as well, where there are some oral histories, but there are certainly some written histories that people that'll be audio that somebody has recorded within the site. But we use based on the Hudson Bay Company archives, a lot of accounts of people who were here. Certainly, some of in past years, we've used the diaries of George Simpson and other folks to sort of contextualize it. And we use a lot of the newspapers, Angus, certainly the Nor'Wester, but also when you look at Thomas Scott's execution, how 2 different newspapers drew that incident differently, right? And you're absolutely right. The primary source material is essential for students to dig deep into these kind of venues. So Claire, are students interested in the environmental history of the river, issues of sustainability, the remaking of the forest for trade? Um, yeah, the idea of ecological literacy, right? That's some, that's actually really, really interesting. I'd be interesting to hear what you have to say. Maybe we can connect afterwards. But that's something that I've never looked at, the environmental history of the river. I mean, that sounds like a PhD thesis in itself. Um, but that's something that needs to be considered. I mean, do they feel connected to the river? I'm not sure. That's what my teaching partner Heather and I try to do, is sort of say, look, this river wraps around us. It is us. It's always present, and yet for the most part we ignore it, right? And it is the story of this place. It carries the stories. It's ancient, and yet a lot of the time we just ignore it, or we throw shopping carts into it. But I'd be interested in hearing maybe a little bit later on if you want to connect on Twitter or something like that, about what kind of work you're doing on that. But that's a fascinating part of it. And I know that one of the streams that the Friends of Upper Fort Garry are putting together in terms of learning resources, one of the themes is the connection to the earth, right? Because as the main hub for the fur trade in that whole community of Red River, every single person who was connected to that fort was connected to the earth and depended on every single thing that, or for every part of their life. Absolutely. Multiple people are typing. I hope that answered your question. I'm not sure if it did. You involve First Nations record interpreters in your visits or at other times? Yeah, Angus, absolutely. Maybe not on visits, but being in Winnipeg for a while, and you generate lots of friends and colleagues. Certainly, we get tons of people to come down and talk about the. I mean, Nigan Sinclair is a great guy. He comes down, takes a lot of time to come down and talk to students about the notion of sharing space, about the idea of treaties, um, about um, about connections to water and to the land, and we bring in uh, Dave Alexander, who wrote the graphic novel series Seventh Generation, and we bring him in after we read his books. We've brought in Mary Kersheen a few times to talk about her residential school experience. It's just really important that not only do the students have a connection with elders, as I've said before, but also that we bring in tons of people, that people feel that SJR is not this sort of snooty little place, which it is at times, I guess, but that it's open to the public, we're inviting people to come in and share space within the institution itself, right? It's a changing place. It's no longer what we what your perceptions might be. Most of the students aren't really rich anymore, and they're funded, or their parents are working crazy jobs, or and the demographics are changing, and the school, the way we teach, is changing, and how we see ourselves in the community is changing as well, and it's all very, very positive. Laurel, I appreciate your perspective on sharing space. In 1941, Watson Kirk Connell wrote a fascinating little book, Canadians All, describing the importance of the immigrant population in Winnipeg in Canada. We perhaps need to. Yeah, I think you're right. Absolutely. Um, if people read anymore, I don't know if people read books anymore. But no, absolutely. And I don't know what the solutions are. I mean, it's interesting that Mayor Bowman um, is creating this website. I don't know if you read in the Freep today, but creating the website to sort of figure out how do we move beyond racism and the McLean's article and all that kind of stuff. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't have the answers for that. If I did, I'd probably have a Nobel Prize, but that isn't the case. And then Jay, to get your students involved in recording oral histories, absolutely. Every few years, we have a major paper due, but with the major paper, they have to collect oral histories, and we've done it on a variety of things. We did it on buildings once. We did it on Winnipeg General Strike. We did it this year. It's Hudson Bay Company, so I have to collect an oral history on the Hudson Bay Company itself. So oral histories are huge, particularly when it forces the students to take risks, to engage with the community, and the results are generally really, really powerful. Our area is very much one race, small town. It was established by a variety of groups of people, which recommendations on teaching the children about diversity when it's not around them every day, especially with the younger students. Yeah, I mean, race is an interesting, Christine, is an interesting case. I always suggest that it doesn't exist, and it's a construct, right? So that's maybe where you want to start. I mean, connecting kids with kids is the easiest thing to do. I think with Google Hangouts and Skype and FaceTime and all that stuff, it's really easy to connect with classrooms and people all over the world. In the last couple of weeks, I've had, John Ralston Saul, Des Morton, Charlotte Gray's Skyping in. So the ability to connect not only with the historians, but then with other communities, getting your kids to connect with elders throughout the country with kids their age. I think it's obligatory. I think you have to do it. And there's a lot of great examples out of Manitoba where I have a bunch of friends who are working in Hutterite colonies where you want to talk about no diversity, but they're forcing these kids to learn about different cultures. There's a great example of a young guy, Alex Knott, who is an Indigenous guy, great guy. He spoke at TEDx Youth last year, where he basically forced himself to go to Hutterite colonies and talk about the fact that there isn't fresh water on reserves, and he basically shoved the 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 issues concerning First Nations communities down the throats of these Hutterite kids, and they've developed absolutely great friendships, and the Hutterites learned a lot, and Alex and his crew learned a lot. And I think that's the only way that we break down those barriers of the other is by fundamentally exposing ourselves to each other. And it's like we're not exposing ourselves to each other. That's a weird way of saying that, but sharing ideas and sharing space in that way. Don't expose yourself to people, please.
Hopefully, everybody takes away more than don't expose yourself to people from tonight's webinar. Matt, thank you very much for joining me and working with Canada's history to be the first of the 7 of the series. If anybody has any more questions, right now is the time to ask before we wrap up. Otherwise, I suggest contacting Matt through Twitter, and I'm sure he'd be more than happy to answer your follow-up questions there. Matt, did you have any last words for tonight?
No, I just want to thank everybody. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of people who have trucked out, and yeah, I would love to connect. Let's connect everybody. I'll steal your ideas, and I won't give you credit. And I hope you do the same. I don't think as teachers we should be um, holding on to our ideas, but steal away from me, and I'll steal away from you, so that we can really cause some transformation in the lives of our students.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. This will be the ending of the webinar. Thank you, everybody, for coming up. Feel free to comment as everybody's leaving. I will leave the windows open for the next half hour if you would like to maintain conversation. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Jess.
You're welcome.